Hi there. So in this video, I want to touch on three topics as a kind of response to the work that you guys did with the synchronous and asynchronous activities for Elizabeth Alexander's The Trayvon Generation and Cathy Park Hong's The Slur I Never Expected to Hear in 2020. So the three topics that I want to touch on are A, the inclusion of multiple perspectives, B, voice, and C, sympathy versus empathy. To start off with the inclusion of multiple perspectives, some of you classified the Trayvon Generation as memoir because it offered different perspectives. You can make that argument, and I would definitely classify Alexander's essay as memoir if we had to force it into one of the two categories. But I would also argue that one might find a variety of perspectives equally an autobiography and memoir, even though in both cases, the variety of perspectives would ultimately be filtered through and arranged by the author's singular viewpoint. The difference, however, is you'll find memoirs where the author might not be the main character, or at least not the only main character. You'll often see memoirs that are devoted to the experience of someone else. For example, Patti Smith's Just Kids, which I happen to have right here. And you can see even on so Patti Smith, if you don't know who she is, she's a famous singer-songwriter, kind of the godmother of punk, they call her. And she's written this book about her relationship with her friend, Robert Mapplethorpe, who is a famous photographer. And you can see on the front page, we have a picture of two of them. So she's definitely one of the main characters, but just as much time is devoted in this memoir to Robert Mapplethorpe as is devoted to her own private experience. And all of the experience that she talks about in this book somehow relate back to Robert Mapplethorpe. So he's just as equally a main character as Patti Smith is in this book. And the Trayvon Generation, insofar as we might call it a memoirish piece of writing, although I don't know if I would securely lock it into being strictly a memoir or strictly autobiography. It's definitely personal, but I think it's also something else because it spends so much time talking about the broader social sphere. But insofar as we're going to force it into one of those categories, they're definitely called a memoir. And she, even when it's personal, she's not talking about herself so much, right? She's talking about her children. Her children are really the main characters more than she is, even though she's offering her perspective on them and her own reflections on them. So another thing, in response to what some of you said on the close reading exercise, such as Dasha, who said of Hong's essay, it didn't even seem like I was reading, it felt like I was listening to them tell their story. Something else to consider as you work on your own personal narratives is the voice you are using to craft your essay. And this will probably be slightly different, a slightly different voice, or at least a different tone to the one you will use when you start working on your argumentative essays. But I encourage you to pay really close attention to the style and tone that you're using in all cases. What emotional resonance do you want the reader to experience? Do you want them to laugh, feel sad, get angry? How do you want to come across as the narrator? Do you want to come across as angry, as silly, as embarrassed? Obviously, creating more and more complex mixtures of emotion is something to strive for. For example, perhaps your first person voice is an angry voice, but with the intention of producing laughter in the audience, producing laughter in the reader. You might be presenting yourself as really angry, but contextualizing it in such a way that it's meant to be funny for the reader. So you get this complexity of emotions. That's an example. So pay really careful attention to things like word choice and the way you're describing things. Different words might refer to the same thing, like dog or pooch, right? They both mean this canine creature, the dog. But you could call it a dog or a pooch. Different words mean the same thing, but they produce different feelings and associations in the audience. So be really aware of that. Similarly, the way you describe things impart different moods, right? If I'm creating a joyful tone, I might describe a certain pooch as being full of life and energy, woof, woof, woofing away to announce his overflowing spirit to the world. But if I'm trying to create a grim atmosphere, maybe I would describe the dog, this barking dog, like the dog's relentless yapping as part of a mob of noise that was trampling the thoughts in my head. Right, so these things like word choice, descriptors, qualifiers of mood, so on and so forth, all of these things culminate in a specific tone. And you want to be really aware of that, whether you're writing a personal narrative or whether you're writing an argumentative essay, whatever you're writing, you always want to be aware of the voice that you're producing, the emotional resonance that you're producing, right? So it's not just conveying the information, it's about making the reader feel a certain way. Which gets us to the last topic I wanted to cover in this video, which is the distinction between sympathy and empathy, two concepts that are frequently confused. But let's quickly break those down, see how they're different. Sympathy is feelings of pity and sorrow for someone else's misfortune, whereas empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. What it seems from reading your close reading exercises about the slur I never expected to hear in 2020, it seems that most of you felt more empathy for her, for Hong. A lot of people said they felt feelings of outrage and so on and so forth, but there wasn't a lot of like pitying her as a narrator. She did, however, create a lot of feelings of where people could sort of feel what she was feeling and really relate on that level. And there might be elements of sympathy in that as well, but she did a really good job, and a lot of you pointed this out, of making her feelings relatable and understandable. So think about that as you go and get to work on your personal narratives. Is your main goal for the reader to feel sorry, to feel pity for you as the narrator? Or is it for the reader to understand the feelings that you're feeling from this experience? To see the world as you see it, or at least to view these events as you saw them, to bring them over to, if not your side necessarily, at least to your realm of understanding, to make them understand what you feel, right? Or maybe you don't want sympathy or empathy. Maybe you just want it to be completely objectified, like animals in some kind of lab experiment, which is perfectly open game as well. You don't necessarily have to create any strong, specific emotional connections in that sense. And that in and of itself, the lack of emotion, just a cold, hard look at a series of events or at a particular event, that, that sort of paradoxically creates its own emotion in the reader, feelings of coldness and so on and so forth. But anyway, take all of these things into account. The inclusion of multiple perspectives, if you're going to include different perspectives or not, you don't necessarily have to do one or the other. It doesn't matter. The point is to consider your choices and to think about how you're presenting them. Consider the voice you're using, the tone, the emotional resonances and moods that it's conveying, and consider whether or not you want to create a sense of sympathy, a sense of empathy, or neither of these. If you want to create something else altogether, a different emotional landscape altogether, you have options.